We are transitioning again. As we move into November this month, we have a series of lectures on Latinx studies. And so we have 3 really great lecturers who are going to be with us this month. And the first of them is Jennifer Owens-Jofre, Dr. Jennifer Owens-Jofre, who is who's a graduate of the GTU. She has her PhD from the Graduate Theological Union, and is currently in a postdoc through the Louisville Institute and teaching at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. So another Presbyterian seminary, we lost her to the one in the middle. But we're excited to have her with us today to talk about hospitality and colorism. So she's writing some notes on the board for you, but if you wouldn't mind helping me welcome our lecturer. As a gentle reminder, please make sure that your cellular devices are, the ringer is turned off, because we don't want to pick those up on the lecture. All right, Jen.
Great. So we're going to start with introductions, and I'm going to invite you to write a few things down before we actually introduce ourselves out loud. And you're going to introduce yourselves to one another, and then I'm going to invite just a couple of you to say a little bit about the communities in which you'll work. So let's start at the beginning. I'd like you to write down your name, program, and year, your age, your gender, your faith tradition, your racial or ethnic background, anything else you think is helpful for someone in your class or me to know about your identity, and then the community where you currently minister or aim to work in some way. Like whatever your community of accountability is, that's what I want to know about here. And I'm going to ask that you keep that community in mind as we go through the lecture and our conversation today. Thank you for bearing with my messy writing. I appreciate it.
And I'm going to challenge folks when you do your sharing with a partner to find someone here that you don't know as well. Not to stick with your familiar friends.
And I just want to clarify. That we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A as we go through, and then there will be time for these questions at the end of our conversation today, these 3 questions. So I'm going to hold the large group introductory, here's my community time, until we get to the very end of our conversation today. So what I'm saying is I won't ask you to introduce yourselves to the large group now, but when you make your comments at the end of our conversation, I'll ask you to do that then. So just to be clear about that and to honor the time that we do have together. I also want to thank Professor Norton for having invited me to join y'all as a part of the important work this campus is doing around the matters we'll discuss today. It really is an honor to be here with you, and I've been looking forward to our conversations today. What I'll share with you on the themes of hospitality and colorism is a work in progress. This is my first time speaking publicly about my fieldwork in light of these themes. And as a result of that, I'm going to ask that you not share these reflections beyond this space for now. So no live tweeting and no putting quotes from the presentation up on Facebook as we're talking. I particularly look forward to the moments we'll have for dialogue about some of these ideas. One of the foci of my doctoral studies was Latinx theology, a theological perspective that takes context seriously. As Latinx theologians like Carmen Nenco Fernandez, Edwin Aponte, and Miguel de la Torre have argued in their own respective ways, context matters. Who is doing the work of interpreting our sacred texts and traditions? On what sources do they draw in those interpretations? For Latinx theologians like Nenco Fernandez, lo cotidiano, or daily living, is a source for theological construction and offers, quote, content as well as context, ultimately concretizing what can be a more abstract intellectual exercise. Often described as a contextual theology, Latinx theology not only is clear about its own context as a theology that is being done alongside members of a particular community, but its epistemological and hermeneutical commitments point to the ways in which all theologies are, in fact, contextual. All theologies are produced by individuals who are members of particular communities with their own ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of doing, ways of knowing. So in light of that, I'll begin by situating myself more intentionally. I am a light-skinned Latina woman. While all of our identities are much more complicated than that brief description of my own reveals, I start there because those are the primary aspects of my identity that affected the way I approached my fieldwork, which I'll talk about more in a moment. These are the aspects of social location that create lenses that guide my interpretations of texts, whether that text is an encounter with another living being or with the written word, which arguably is also living in and of itself. As a light-skinned Latina, I often pass as white. This is a function of colorism, and here's your definition for those of you who might be taking notes. The privileging of those with light skin over those with dark skin within and across racial communities, or racialized communities. Alice Walker developed the term colorism, and she used it to describe what she saw in her community. My passing happens in part because many of us are socialized to see particular physical features as representative of racial categories. I negotiate perceptions of my whiteness and my Latinidad regularly, but the reason I raise the issue of passing are two. First, passing as white often makes me privy to conversations, especially conversations about race and about color, to which I believe I would not be otherwise. In addition, and perhaps more obviously, passing as white fails to recognize the fullness of my Latinidad, of my identity as a Latina woman who has been raised with cultural traditions that are not part of the dominant culture in the United States. In addition, I am a woman who comes from cultures marred by machismo. Here, I am using the term machismo to refer to the system of sexist beliefs and practices that, as Ana Castillo points out in Massacre of the Dreamers, affects any culture in which, quote, men who feel racially, culturally, and or because of economic hardships will turn on those whom they feel they can order about and humiliate, usually women, children, and animals, just as they have been ordered about and humiliated by those few privileged who are in power, close quote. These lenses, those of a light-skinned Latina woman, affect not only how I see the world, but the visual markers of my appearance affect the ways in which the world sees me. In her book, Visible Identities, Race, Gender, and the Self, Linda Martín Alcoff interweaves insights into the world of philosophy with anecdotes from her experiences as a light-skinned Latina. In doing so, she contrasts what she calls an ocular-centric epistemology and an epistemology that is, quote, based on the auditory senses. In other words, she is differentiating between ways of knowing that rely on what we can perceive with our eyes and ways of knowing that rely on what we can perceive with our ears. She critiques ocular-centric epistemologies on the grounds that they occlude the interpretations we make in tandem with what we see. Summarizing her critique of ocular-centric epistemologies, she writes, quote, "If knowing is seeing, then what cannot be seen cannot be known or considered," close quote. On the other hand, she offers that ways of knowing that rely on our auditory senses are inherently dialogical. They are communal in the sense that they draw on the wisdom of at least two dialogue partners as they interpret what is said and what is heard. Here, I want to apply her insight about, quote, knowledge based on the auditory sense, close quote, to today's conversation about hospitality and colorism. The primary proposition I'd like to suggest today is this: especially for those who come to these conversations with the privilege of light skin, listening to those the dominant culture often characterizes as other, particularly those others in our communities whom machista beliefs and practices disempower, is a concrete practice with liberative potential. Taking on this posture of listening, taking on a listening posture, is integral to mujerista theological method, a method Ada Maria Isasi Diaz pioneered, and the method upon which I built in my dissertation. We'll return to this concern for taking on a posture of listening in a few moments. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the Latinx Catholic parish where I did my field work. So we're going to turn to the field, and I'm going to abbreviate Latinx Catholic parish very cleverly by calling it LCP. To protect their identities, to honor my commitment to their anonymity, and then also all of the names that you hear are pseudonyms, so I'm not using their given names. So LCP is located in the greater Los Angeles area. The neighborhood in which it is situated is young, with the majority of its residents in the 18 to 35 range in age. The neighborhood is economically poor, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the greater Los Angeles area, and it is predominantly Mexican and Salvadoran in terms of ethnic background, and predominantly Latinx. Before moving on, it will be helpful to know about the characteristics of the sample I gathered at LCP. Over the course of 2 winters in 2015 and 2016, I engaged in approximately 140 to 145 hours of participant observation, and I conducted a total of 32 interviews during that time, interviewing some participants more than once, but no more than twice. For the purposes of my dissertation, I relied on 20 interviews collected from 14 people, 10 women and 4 men. Interviewees were given an option between interviewing in English or in Spanish. 8 of them chose English and 6 of them chose Spanish, and one that I didn't ultimately include in my dissertation took place in Spanglish, as we say. We just kind of moved back and forth as each of us was comfortable with our abilities in the respective languages. Spanish is my second language. 12 of the interviewees are Latinx and 2 are Anglo. 9 of the 14 interviewees are married. All of those who are married are also Latina women, 3 of whom are mothers and 6 of whom are now grandmothers as well. Vocationally speaking, 8 are parishioners, 3 are lay ecclesial ministers, 2 of whom are women and 1 is a man, and 3 are priests, 2 are Anglo and 1 is Latino. At the time of their interviews, 10 of these interviewees lived in the neighborhood surrounding the parish, and 4 did not. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about mujerista theology. How many of you have heard this term before? How many of you are relatively familiar with mujerista theology? Great. Okay. Because I'm really just going to paint with a soft brush. So before moving on to the content of my findings, it's important to note the methods that I used. I drew heavily on the work of Ada Maria Isasi Diaz and to a lesser degree on that of Yolanda Tarango, both of whom are founding mothers of mujerista theology. Born in Havana, Cuba, Isasi Diaz came to the United States with her family during her teenage years settling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She became a vowed religious woman shortly after she finished high school, joining the Ursuline Sisters in Santa Rosa, California. Later, she left, but she joined early on in her life. Isasi Diaz describes herself as having been born a feminist on Thanksgiving weekend of 1975, when she gathered with hundreds of other Catholic women to, quote, insist on the right of women to be ordained to a renewed priestly ministry, close quote, in the Catholic Church. She is best known for the development of Mujerista theology, which, like its sister, womanist theology, takes seriously the relationship between theology and ethics. She served as professor of ethics at Drew University until shortly before her passing on May 13th, 2012. With Tarango, Isasi Diaz developed the term Mujerista theology, and together they wrote from that theological perspective. In the earliest publication on their developing method, Hispanic Women, Prophetic Voice in the Church, which was released by Harper & Row in 1988, they told of the importance of their methodology being, quote, different from those of other liberation theologies, given the specific nature of Hispanic women's experience, close quote. This methodology included a dialogical process by which groups of Latina women gather together and consider prayerfully their experiences of life, as well as the implications of those experiences for action. Isasi Diaz and Tarango then culled from those conversations the themes they had heard and shared those ideas with the women who had participated in order to ensure that they were accurately hearing what the participants had intended. For my own part, I followed the spirit of the example of Isasi Diaz. While I used different sociological tools than those that Isasi Diaz did, I kept the spirit of her work present in my in-depth interviews and participant observation at LCP. So Isasi Diaz usually used ethno-methodology and another tool, the name of which is not at my brain right now, whereas I used grounded theory to kind of get at the lived experience of these women. The priests, and so I'm going to talk next about some of what I encountered there that has to do with this theme of listening, like taking a posture of listening, not only in priestly ministry, but also in faith-based community organizing. So the priests of LCP are well aware of the importance of listening in their ministries. And remember that all of the priests who were assigned to the parish at the time that I was there were Anglo, and the community is almost totally Latinx. When I interviewed a former pastor of the parish, who I'll call Father Chris, about his early days there, he shared with me about the caste system, he called it, that had existed among the parishioners, especially language-wise. He explained it this way, quote, so the bilingual Latino, Mexicano, Chicano, that was the highest rung. And then the next rung was the monolingual Mexicano. And then lower than that was the Central American. So there was a kind of order, and people just sort of acknowledged it, that it was a largely Mexican community. But if you were a bilingual, Chicano, you're the one who could speak to the authorities. So there was this sort of caste system based on language, he says. If I were to have the opportunity to interview him again, one of the things I would ask him is where he would have seen himself as fitting into that system he described to me as an Anglo priest with limited abilities in Spanish at the time that he was first assigned to the parish. Rather surprisingly, his limited abilities proved to be an asset in his approach to leadership. For as he relates, his shortcomings with Spanish made room for the women in the parish, all lay women, all of them mothers, many of them now grandmothers, to lead, especially in the faith-based community organizing efforts at the parish. This is how he described it. And this is a quote from him. When I became pastor, it was hard, he said. But again, it was, I didn't speak the language very well, which was a benefit because then the people themselves had to speak. So where in the past, the priest was the spokesman, even when the mayor was there, he would go on the protest or whatever, it was the priest who spoke. Well, this priest couldn't speak. So you pushed the people ahead, which was great, which is what you wanted, close quote. In his words, we hear an acknowledgement of his limitations in facility with Spanish and a recognition of where there was facility with that language in the parish. He took stock of where the gifts in the community were and made space for those who had the necessary gifts for leadership, not relying so much on what he could perceive with his eyes, but quite literally with what he could perceive with his ears. Chief among those gifts for leadership were those with gifts for leadership were the lay women of the community. As one of the current associate pastors, Father Luke, put it, "It may look as if we priests are in charge," he said, "because we are up there celebrating Mass at the altar, but we take our cues from the women in the community. These women, especially the abuelitas, the grandmas, have been in the neighborhood a lot longer than we have, and we're lucky they're willing to share their wisdom with us," he said. Many of them having been parishioners, and this is me now, not Father Luke anymore. So many of them having been parishioners for several years longer than the priests would even be assigned to the parish altogether. These women were intimately familiar with the realities of lo cotidiano, of daily living at the parish. Some of these abuelitas, these grandmas, had grown up in the neighborhood. Others of these abuelitas had been parishioners since they first were married. As a result of years of experience, they know what is going well in the parish and in the neighborhood. They know what the strengths of the ministries of the parish are. And they know very well the needs of the parish and of the neighborhood. And in this way, they're well equipped to guide the priestly ministries of those assigned to the parish. So that was a little bit about listening in priestly ministry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about listening in faith-based community organizing. So another way in which the priests of the parish listened to the cotidiana wisdom of these women is in their support of the peace walks, las caminatas por la paz, and the neighborhood masses, las misas del barrio. Initiated by the mothers and the grandmothers of the community in the 1990s, when gang violence in the neighborhood was at its height, the peace walks are processions through the neighborhood with candles, the parish banner, and lots of singing that take place after a neighbor has been murdered as a result of gang violence, or more commonly, in recent years, police violence. They stop at the place where that young person has been killed, and one of the priests of the parish says Mass there as a means of, quote, reclaiming that space as holy ground. In initiating these peace walks, these women had been paying attention to the violence in the neighborhood. They knew of its impact on their families, as well as on the families of the young people who were taking part in it. They saw the ways in which neighbors would hide their faces from the places where young people had been killed, and the way they would avoid that sight altogether in going about their day in the neighborhood. This reclamation of space is a form of resistance against the violence being perpetuated in the neighborhood. As one interviewee, a lay ecclesial minister on the parish team, I'll call Lita, put it, "Our community wants something more for our young people." And I would add to that this community does not simply have a desire for a different way of living for their young people, but they act on that desire by creating pathways to that new way of living. One of the women who is key to creating such pathways, Lupe, facilitates restorative justice circles between those who have harmed others and those who have endured that harm. Having lost 2 of her brothers to violence in the 1990s, and having lost her mother to illness more recently, she knows what it is to live with and through loss. When she first lost her brothers, she was resistant to the possibility of forgiving those who had harmed them, and in turn, her family and those who loved her brothers. However, her mother encouraged her to pray with Our Lady of Guadalupe. With time and through participation in these restorative justice circles, Lupe was able to work through the anger she had harbored toward those who had murdered her brothers. And those experiences inform her work with restorative justice today. I interviewed Lupe twice about her relationship with Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the second time, as I thanked her for her openness, she told me that she trusts me. She said that she trusts me because I came back to the neighborhood. During that conversation, she was saying, a lot of people come in for a little while and come see what happens, and then we never see them again. But she was saying, you came back. Like, that says something to me about who you are. And she said that she could see that I was listening to them, that through the questions I was asking of her, it was important to me that I get the story right from the perspective of her community. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about insights from the field on hospitality and colorism. So we're going to go back to that proposition that I suggested at the very beginning of the presentation, which was this: especially for those who come to these conversations with the privilege of light skin, listening to those the dominant culture often characterizes as other, particularly those others in our communities whom machista beliefs and practices disempower, is a concrete practice with liberative potential. To be plain, we need to listen not only to women who lack the privilege of light skin, but also to women who have been present and active and listening to the communities we aim to serve as researchers and as ministers. So first, I'm going to talk about hospitality. The initiative to do the fieldwork for my dissertation at LCP was mine. An invitation did not come from the parish for me to join them initially, but rather it was the other way around. Like, my advisor had suggested, maybe check out this parish as a potential place to do your fieldwork, see how it goes, and we can kind of go from there. And I was living in the Bay at the time. So one of the ways I showed them my appreciation for their hospitality was through listening to their stories, by handling those stories with care, and by amplifying only those aspects of their stories I have permission to share. In many ways, the relationships I have built with women like Lupe involve more risk for them than they do for me. When they first met me, they didn't know me at all. They knew of my credentials from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, but they didn't know me as a person. When I had been doing fieldwork at LCP for about 3 weeks, one of the interviewees, Elena, flipped the script, aiming to learn more about me and about my background than I had volunteered at the parish thus far. About your questions, Elena said, I have questions for you. Is it okay if I turn off the recorder? I asked. My battery needs to charge before my last interview tonight. Of course, Elena said. And then it got a little bit more pointed. She says, why are you interested in Our Lady of Guadalupe? Like, this has been the focus of my research. This has been the focus of our conversation preceding. And then she says, are you Catholic? Yes, I said. I've been Catholic my whole life. I came to know Our Lady of Guadalupe through my studies. I had seen her image before, but I didn't start to spend time with her and really pray with her until last fall. I was learning about her in a class, and I was going to demonstrations in Oakland with the Movement for Black Lives, and I remember thinking, she would understand. She would know what it's like for people in power to disrespect the lives of her children because of the color of their skin. Isn't that part of why she appeared to Juan Diego? Elena nodded. Mothers in this neighborhood can relate to Black mothers who are losing their children, she said. They know what it's like to lose children to violence, to be afraid for their safety when they are in the hands of people in power. Tears were in our eyes, and we wept together in silence. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself and your story with me, I said, and thank you for asking me why I'm here. Thank you for coming here and for asking your questions, Elena said. Will you come back? She asked. I hope so, I said. This was during the first round of fieldwork, and I wasn't sure about funding or anything having to do with next steps, so I was not going to make a promise that I couldn't honor. I said, I don't know yet, but I would like to. If you come back, she said, you'll need to stay with my family. We'd love to have you with us. A member of the choir at LCP, Elena flipped the script when I first interviewed her during Advent of 2015. In the narrative above, which is based on notes written the day after the interview, Elena was kind and polite, yet surprised me with her questions. In asking those questions, Elena got to know me a little bit better, and she and her family showed me a kind of hospitality, hosting me for a little over 3 months the following winter that made the fieldwork for my dissertation possible. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about colorism. Part of what I am learning from the community at LCP has to do with colorism as well. During an interview with a Jesuit novice, the only Latino priest who attends LCP, and he's not assigned there, but he attends and kind of helps out with music here and there. He's a really good drummer, which is fun to have, I think, at some of the masses and other services they have. But anyway, this Latino priest, we'll call him Father Daniel, he relayed a conversation to me that he had had with one of the Latino men with whom he serves. During that conversation, that man, who I'll call Omar, reflected on his relationship with one of the Anglo priests at the parish, Father Chris, that pastor, who described the linguistic caste system he had observed during the time at the parish when he first arrived. Father Chris had worked so closely with the parishioners of LCP, had listened so well to their stories, to their needs and wants for the future of LCP and its neighborhood, had stepped back that they might shape the pathways forward toward the more that the parish wants for their young people, that Omar called him Latino. He's Latino, he said. Father Chris doesn't look like us, but he's one of us. When Father Daniel first shared with me this story, the academic in me started to problematize the perspective that Omar presented on the inside. I did not say any of this to the interviewee who was relaying the conversation to me. So I certainly didn't share any of those concerns with Father Daniel or members of the parish community, but I did start to work over the idea in my mind. I had concerns about the dangers of advocating for a kind of colorblindness, which I don't think is possible or even a desirable goal, given the history of systemic racism in our country and the ways in which race is tied to the observation of physical characteristics in the United States. And I had concerns about the potential precedent it would establish for a Latino man to describe an Anglo man as Latino, as though an Anglo person can somehow abandon their whiteness. But then I thought more about what Father Daniel actually had said to me, like what the actual words were he had used to say how Omar had described Father Chris. He's Latino. He doesn't look like us, but he's one of us. And while I still am hesitant to use the same language to describe an Anglo priest, I have a deeper appreciation for what Omar is saying from where I sit. He's appreciating the commitment Father Chris has shown to his community, so much so that he feels like Father Chris is one of his own. Omar is expanding his definition of race to allow for a type of racial border crossing. And Omar is Latino. He comes from a context in which light-skinned people colonized their indigenous brothers and sisters. His roots reach back to Latin America, a context that Martín Alcoff argues allows mixedness to be normative. And for Martín Alcoff, this is not true of North America in general or the United States in particular, quote, where racial identity is usually assumed to be unambiguous or pure, close quote. And if Omar wants to allow Father Chris to cross these borders of race, it is not my role to adjudicate what is and is not permissible in Latinx communities of which I'm not a part. It is my job to practice a bit of humility, to listen to the observations they have about their own communities, and to try to learn more about what they are saying, why they are saying what they are saying about one another. In addition, it is important to acknowledge the diversity between and within Latinx communities. Further, we must appreciate that the label of Latino that Omar gave to Father Chris does not necessarily carry over to all Latinx communities. So appreciating the diversity within and across Latinx communities in those ways. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop there because I feel like it's time to stop there. But I'd love to hear some questions that you might have or comments that you might have about what we've talked about thus far. You're welcome to jot ideas down or put hands up, whatever feels most comfortable to you.